And after the histories and the tragedies, we'll finally look at the comedies, of course, on the early modern stage. And again, as a means to structure our thinking about these plays, we will differentiate them into two different main forms. And that is, first of all, the romance type of comedy, and then also the satirical comedy. To start with romance comedy, this has its ancestors on the one hand in Roman comedy, but that's not mainly where the term comes from, but rather from the fact that it is also strongly influenced by medieval romances, these sprawling prose narratives from which it takes a lot of what we would nowadays maybe call fantasy elements, but also improbabilities of the plot and the sprawling tendency of the plot to develop, of characters to multiply, and so on. At the center is a specific type of plot and plot development, of course, that is mainly focused on confusion driving the plot, which is true for both the comedies and the tragedies. But generally speaking, of course, comedies have sort of the reverse plot of tragedies, whereas tragedies often start in a relatively stable, relatively balanced world, and then the world suddenly gets twisted and turned, and in the end, more or less chaos reigns until the very last end, when of course everything needs to be brought back to order again. The comedies often start with the largest amount of confusion very quickly, and then gradually move towards a resolve of the confusion, and then usually end with a happy resolution. So tragedy ends in death, and comedy traditionally ends in marriage. The confusion is usually mostly one of love, and it's often brought on by plot elements like mistaken identities, and mainly misunderstandings, sometimes willful and sometimes unwitting misunderstandings. Separation of characters and reunification, often combined with mistaken identities, often combined with dressing up as someone else, often cross-dressing from male to female, and the other way around, which of course becomes even more strange when you think of the fact that on the early modern stage, only men were allowed to play. So you have boys playing girls who dress up as boys or as men, and so on. A lot of confusion that's added here, and very often it's the struggle of young lovers against older people. So we often have sort of a generational struggle in here. The romance comedy generally celebrates the characters. It celebrates the characters and their love, and also their joyfulness. That's part of the sort of young against old theme here, of course, as well. In the sense that the old often stand for the social norms, for what you can and what you can't do. And of course, in the development of these plots, love can often trump norms or social rules. And generally, the audience laughs with the characters. We laugh about something that they also find joyful. And in terms of settings, the plots are usually removed from contemporary reality. That's one of the major influences of the romances that are also not strictly set in contemporary reality, but rather in faraway places, and often places that are a little bit less real than the real world. Often also with sort of dichotomy that in the play you have one setting that stands for the real world and for all these social norms and social constrictions, but then most of the play will happen in some kind of place that is outside of these boundaries. And this has sometimes been referred to as the green world, because often it is a forest. It's somewhere in nature. Most well known, of course, would be Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, where you have Athens as the frame and as that which stands for rules and laws and constrictions, and then the play happens in the forest, where things can happen, where magic can happen, and where the confusion can reign, but also love, of course. But you also have something like Belmont in The Merchant of Venice. So Venice, again, is a very real place, and it's a place that stands for commerce, for money, for calculations. And Belmont is this fictional island just off Venice, where the plot turns into much more of a fairy tale like plot, but also this is where love trumps over money, and not the other way around, as in Venice. And because of this, the plots are also can be sort of removed from probability. The point isn't to create a very probable narrative, obviously. So most of Shakespeare's comedies fall squarely into that category of the romance comedies, and we'll see how that is different from the comedies of Ben Jonson. But not all of his plays really exactly neatly fall into these categories. So several of his comedies, such as Measure for Measure, All's Well That Ends Well, have a rather unusual tone with a mix of humor and tragedy that is sort of difficult if you just want to have a straight comedy. Then you have these sort of dark elements in them, but that's also not enough to pull them over into tragedy. Often because they also have a happy ending. The most well-known problem play, as they have been called in the canon for us now, is The Merchant of Venice, which in its structure is very clearly a comedy, but has, of course, this very dark story of the merchant and of this sort of revenge plot with the pound of flesh, and also, of course, the character of Shylock, who gains, at least for us, a tragic character. But there are also, as I said, others like Measure for Measure or The Winter's Tale that just don't fit neatly into these categories. So we should always be aware that we can use these categories to better understand structures and better understand differences between plays, but we should also be aware, of course, that authors can do whatever they want and they don't have to follow any of the formulas, even if they themselves have established them, and they can create hybrids or things that straddle the boundaries between different genres. Now, as for the satirical comedy, so that has clearly many differences to the romance comedy. It has its source much more strictly in Roman comedy, particularly Cicero's conception of comedy, and it regards comedy particularly as an imitation of manners. So what you see people do is an imitation of how people are. That's the point. You want to imitate manners, and therefore, of course, open these manners to ridicule whenever they are strange or should be corrected. As such, of course, this kind of comedy is much more a mirror for society. It's not about putting you into this faraway place, but rather to put the mirror in front of you and make you see yourself, which means that these plays have much more of a didactic intention. They are much more geared towards teaching us something, towards making us reflect and probably ideally get better ourselves, because we actually get to see mistakes that we might recognize in us. And that works, of course, best with a striving for contemporaneity. That means you don't want to put your story in this faraway place, in this less real place, where things can happen, but where things are also very different from our own world. But instead, you want to make clear as a playwright that this happens here, this happens now. So The setting is very often close to the setting where the play is actually being watched. So they're often set in England, they're often set in London, they're often set now, so that you really have the idea that what you can see there is something that could happen just outside. So very generally, we can use these two conceptions of comedy to distinguish between the works of these major playwrights, Shakespeare on the one hand and Ben Jonson on the other, with Shakespeare being a playwright that tends towards these romance plots, and Ben Jonson really establishing this satirical tradition of comedy that is then also followed by other writers. And we can, so just sort of to get us an overview, we can sort of compare these two different types once more. So the romance comedy set in the green world, or often in the green world. Jonson's would, in contrast, be rather set in today's London. The romance form also brings with it a relatively loose structure, with loosely flowing plots, often multiple plots, multiple characters. As I said, this is sort of one of the inheritances from the romance, whereas the satirical comedy tends to be more concentrated, to have less locations, and to be closer to this ideal of the classical unities. We've already seen in the history and the tragedies that Shakespeare isn't really one for the unities. His plots often are very large scale and often develop over a longer span of time. Generally, there are different character motivations. In Shakespeare's comedies, characters are often motivated by love, or even ruled over by love, whereas in Jonson's comedies, characters are often ruled by money and by their greed. In Shakespeare, the characters are mostly positive. In that way, this is signified by their names. The names are another sort of throwback to the Romans. All of these names are not names that would be common at the time, but that people would immediately associate with the Romans. So they're called Rosalind, Orlando, Viola, Olivia, Orsino, and this is one of the reasons why I usually tend to not suggest you do Shakespearean comedies for an oral exam, because if you have 3 or 4 of those plays, you will have, I don't know, 24 of those names, and they all sound the same, and it's really very difficult to get them straight. In Jonson, the names, if you look at names like the ones from Volpone, they're called Volpone, which means the fox, Mosca, the fly, Voltore, the vulture. So they're clearly types, and they're clearly meant to have that function, and they're also all negative. So we're really supposed to sort of judge these characters rather harshly. As I said, misunderstanding drives the plots strongly, but in Shakespeare, the misunderstandings are either unintentional or often good-natured, having some fun at the expense of someone, but without really harmful consequences. And the solution to the misunderstanding, once you find out, oh, you have been that person, or you are that person, and so on, that usually brings about happiness and love, and oh, now everything is solved and everything is clear, versus Johnsonian comedy, where the misunderstandings are usually willful acts of deceit. Volpone, of course, being sort of a classical example of this, but also The Alchemist. And they work because everyone wants to be deceived, because they're all equally greedy and equally dishonest. And that means that the solution, once it comes, doesn't bring happiness and joy, but rather brings anger and hatred amongst the characters. So unintended misunderstanding on the one side, and deceitful misunderstandings on the other side of the equation. So in Shakespeare, the multiplicity of plots shows the different conceptions of love. We usually have, when we have sort of several plot lines with different couples, they usually stand for different ideas and different notions of love. Whereas in Jonson's, the concentrated plots show how all characters are basically ruled by the same follies, how everyone is basically similar. So finally, to repeat that, in Shakespeare, we are laughing usually with the characters, whereas in Ben Jonson, we're usually laughing at the characters. And that laughter should, of course, ideally be reflected at us as well. Jonson's comedy is structured, or the main theme that structures Jonson's comedies is this idea of the humours, which is part of medieval understanding of human physiology, but particularly human psychology. So this idea of the humours is that every man is determined by these four different body fluids, and here you see a sort of an overview of these. So there is the yellow bile, there is blood, there is the black bile, and there is phlegm, and these sort of have an influence on our characters, and ideally they're all in balance, and that's good. That's when we are sort of mentally healthy. But once one of those humors dominates the others, then we develop sort of a problematic character, and we are obviously this the theory has been debunked, and the theory is not current anymore. But we are still using the terms that come out of this. So, for example, if your yellow bile is predominant, then you will become a choleric character. Black bile, you will be melancholic. If phlegm dominates, you will be phlegmatic, and blood is a sanguine character, someone who's sort of willing to be aggressive all the time. So we see that this is kind of like a blueprint for creating characters in which one of those humors will then predominate. And indeed, Jonson wrote a lot of comedies that are based on these ideas. Sometimes that is even implied in the title, as in these two plays here: Every Man in His Humor and Every Man Out of His Humor. So alluding to an imbalance of this, but we can see them. The humors apply to the character conception of Jonson throughout most, if not all, of his plays. This is just a quote that shows sort of the explanation that some one peculiar quality does so possess a man, that it doth draw all his effects, his spirits, and his powers in their confluxions, all to run one way. And then once we've created such a character, we can look at the kind of confusion that can come out of this. This also, of course, makes for different endings for these plays. Shakespeare has the classic happy endings of marriage celebrations, often preparation for feasts. The characters have recognized and have learned to overcome their follies, whereas in Jonson, the comedies often actually end at court with the condemnation of the protagonist. Or what is even worse, in Volpone, for example, the scheming villain is not even formally condemned. He's actually sort of getting off free in a way. And that means that the audience is left with the image of a world in which people like Volpone are. So once they exit the theater, they go out into the real world, they know they will meet these exact characters again, and they will have to maybe act accordingly. So that's very much sort of this idea that you the theater doesn't transport you somewhere else, but actually it anchors you into the real world, and it tells you something about the real world, and you find out that maybe the real world is sort of a darker place than you thought. Well, speaking of darkness, that's kind of a good segue into the transition from Elizabethan to Jacobean theater. I will not say too much about that because we've already spent quite a lot of time on the early modern stage. But the terms, of course, come from the rulers that you see here again. So Elizabethan theater until 1603, and then James I, after Elizabeth's death, comes to the throne, and from then on, literature and theater is called Jacobean. And so we can see that, for example, Shakespeare's career spans both Elizabethan and Jacobean eras, but we can see sort of some general tendencies. We see, for example, in comedy, we see a general development away from Shakespeare's comedies to the Johnsonian style of comedies, both in Johnson's own writing and in the writing of others who imitate his style. So there is a prominence of these kind of city comedies on the Jacobean stage. And even Shakespeare's plays and his comedic solutions become more problematic in his later work. So a general darkening of what we get to see on the stage is certainly a characteristic when we move from Elizabethan to Jacobean, or from sort of a central early modern to a late early modern, if that is a term, stage. There is also a difference or a shift in emphasis in terms of the stage. Under Elizabeth, as we saw, the drama was sort of a unified expression as far as social class was concerned, with these very, very large-scale outdoor theaters that housed anyone from the lowest groundlings who would stand there to the balconies, and even to the Queen herself, who would watch some of these plays. So the court watched the same plays as the commoners, but one thing we see in the Jacobean era is that there is sort of an increase in these what we would call private theaters, smaller indoor theaters, and that also means, of course, less paying customers. Prices go up, which means a social limiting of who can actually see these plays. So with the development of these private theaters, drama becomes much more oriented towards the tastes and values of an upper class audience. By the later part of the reign of Charles I, comes after James, few new plays were actually being written for the public theaters, which basically sustained themselves on the accumulated works of the previous decades, and most plays were written for these smaller venues where the aristocracy basically came to watch these plays. So this also has some is often seen as a reason for a turn towards sort of the darkness, the more problematic aspect of Jacobean theater that has less emphasis on morality, and a much more sympathetic look on all kinds of transgressions, all the way to the incest in Tis Pity She's a Whore, where these incestual characters are seen with, on the one hand, more sympathy than you would expect, but then on the other hand, none of the characters is really good. So these are really some of the darkest plays that we have on the English stage. This is also one of the high times of the revenge plays that turn very gruesome and very problematic. So Jacobean dramatic writers became preoccupied with the problem of evil. Plays of John Webster, Cyril Turner, Thomas Middleton, and William Rowley induce all the terror of tragedy, but with little of its pity. So there's little relief, there's very little light at the end of the tunnel. So these are really fascinating and problematic and ambiguous plays. So definitely go check out some of these rather strange plays. And before we come to the end of the early modern stage, here's sort of a question for you. What is the most influential text of Jacobean or maybe even English literature? And I give you a few hints, because it is not part of English literature. In fact, it wasn't written by a single author. It's not even considered as part of literature. And it's not even the creation of a new work. So what can that be? I give you the answer on the next slide. And it is, of course, the Bible, and not just any Bible, but what we have come to know as the King James Bible, which is a translation that was finished in 1611. So a translation of the Bible into English. Here you see the original title page of this, and this is an important text for many reasons. Partly for its gestation, how it came to be. That comes out of the political and religious developments at the beginning of the 17th century, particularly with the Hampton Court Conference of 1604, a meeting that was convened as a discussion between James I and representatives of the Church of England, including leading English Puritans. So this was a tribute to the growing factions within the Church of England about how to interpret Christianity, and James tried to mediate between the different factions. That will, of course, to sort of give a little bit of a foreshadowing, that will relatively soon lead to a major civil war in England. So as a way to, as kind of a peace offer for all of these factions, James offered a new translation of the Bible, and that translation was to correct errors that favored wrong interpretation. Translation, of course, particularly of a religious text, is always a touchy thing when you can do a lot in terms of interpreting what is actually meant by a certain term, by a certain phrase, and so on. So this new version would conform with some of the ideas of the Puritans. So there was this committee set. The task of translation was undertaken by 47 different scholars. The scholars worked in 6 committees, 2 that were based at each of the University of Oxford, Cambridge, and Westminster. And the committee included scholars with Puritan sympathies as well as high churchmen, so that they could sort of all get their say here. And then this new translation was published in 1611. So it's already important as a document in this political development and religious development in England, but even more so for the language that it used. This King James Bible, also called the Authorized Version of the Bible, has been called the most influential version of the most influential book in the world in what is now its most influential language. It has had an immense impact on English language. It has contributed 257 idioms to English, so phrases that we now recognize or use in our common speech that have originated in this one book, more than any single author and any single source, including Shakespeare. So whenever we put words into someone's mouth, or see the writings on the wall, or go from strength to strength, or eat, drink, and be merry, or fight the good fight, or bemoan the signs of the times, or find a fly in the ointment, or use words such as long-suffering, scapegoat, and peacemaker, we are unconsciously quoting from the King James Bible. Although the Authorized Version's former monopoly on the English-speaking world has diminished, by now there are more modern and maybe even more correct translation, but it is still the most popular translation, for example, in the United States, especially among evangelicals. And it is certainly unparalleled in its influence on the language of Anglophone writers for the last 400 years. If you read writers all the way until the 21st century, all the way into writers like Cormac McCarthy, for example, you would just hear these echoes of this kind of language. So really, for several reasons, you should read the Bible. But if you're in English studies, of course, you should read the King James Bible. Maybe not front to back, but you should definitely get an ear for the sound of this language. And also there are some gripping stories in there. Check out this book and check out particularly this translation of the Bible, because you will hear it. You will hear echoes of this language for the next 400 years. And that brings us finally to the end of early modern theater. You will have already heard a very clear date for the end of this important and large-scale theatrical development. So how does that come about? And of course, the end point is one that is determined by politics. I will just very briefly sketch this, because you will hear much more about this in the introduction to the UK, for example. So Jacobean, we saw, is under the reign of James I. This was a relatively stable and calm, politically speaking, calm era that goes from 1603 to 1625, and we saw how James really tried to reconcile the different factions and tried to keep them all at bay. After him comes Charles I, and Charles immediately got into trouble with Parliament and with the other aristocrats. Now, he needed Parliament to generate money through taxes. Parliament basically had the purse, but he did not want to give it political power. He did not want to stray from the path of a relatively absolutist kind of monarchy. So that was a political problem. But also he married a Catholic, which immediately, of course, brought this major problem of the different religious confessions, and that brought the prospect of a Catholic heir. Even if he didn't convert to Catholicism, the child might be brought up as a Catholic, and then suddenly you have a Catholic king. So that was problematic, and he even tried to sort of re-Catholicize the Anglican Church to sort of move it closer to a Catholic interpretation of Christianity. So all of that, of course, created a strong resistance in parts of England and particularly in Scotland. So there were increasing conflicts with Parliament that then led to the Civil War, which lasted from 1642 to 1651. And you can see that Charles's reign goes all the way to 1649, because that is the point in time where he's actually executed. So he's on the losing side of the war, and in 1649 the king is publicly executed. Now, a very singular occurrence in English history. And we'll come back to some of the reverberations of this, but for our purpose, the important date here is rather 1642, because the Puritan faction that had long been powerful in London gained control of the city rather early in the English Civil War, so that on the 2nd of September 1642, they ordered the closure of all London theatres. Puritans weren't really fans of the theater. They weren't fans of any kind of fictional literature, and particularly that kind of entertainment was very suspect to them. And politically, many of the playwrights and the actors were clients of the monarchy and of the aristocracy, and rather supported the royalist cause. So there was a lot of animosity. So they closed down all the theaters, and the theaters remained closed for the next 18 years. So just imagine, for 18 years there is no theatrical entertainment or no theater, no public theaters in England at all, and it's only with the reopening of the theaters in after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 that drama comes back. So that's a very decisive and clear cut to this development, and we'll see what happens once the theaters open up again. The Civil War in general, the Civil War period is, of course, a period that is dominated by political writing. There is a huge amount of political writing, theological writing from all of these different factions, but no really very significant development in any of the literary genres. And we will then, in the next series of videos, look at what happens in the 17th centuries in the genres, first of all in poetry, and then what happens with theaters once they open.